Good morning and welcome to Rising. Today we have a show that you will be proud to say that you watched. Won't necessarily remember where you were when you watched it, but you'll be glad you watched it at least.
I'm so
you won't
glad
feel like you wasted your time.
So glad we're back to the traditional opening for the show. Well, Julia Manchester and Emily Jashinsky will discuss Senator Rand Paul's amendment with us that would oust Fauci from the NIAID. Batya Ungar-Sargon will weigh in on the media's handling of inflation reporting, specifically those rising prices at the pump. Plus, we'll bring you updates on Ukraine and the Julian Assange case later in the show.
But before we get to all of that, China is announcing brand new, guess what, COVID restrictions as the country faces its worst outbreak yet. So far, China has ordered more than 51 million people into lockdown after 1,437 cases were reported across dozens of cities Monday and doubled to 3,507 cases on Tuesday. According to the AP, a fast-spreading variant known as the stealth Omicron. So far, China has recorded more than 10,000 cases in the first 2 weeks of this month. However, no new deaths have been reported.
China's zero-tolerance policy has forced Beijing to shutter entire provinces, including non-essential businesses in Shenzhen and surrounding provinces that produce 23% of Chinese exports in 2021, according to the American Prospect. China's extreme COVID measures will add to global shortages and supply-driven inflation. So Director of Research at the American Economic Liberties Project and author Matt Stoller joins us now to discuss the impact this will have here at home. Matt, welcome back.
Thanks for having me.
And so when you heard that Shenzhen was going to be going into a lockdown, what was the first thing you thought? And as you've looked at it more, what are the ripple effects going to be, not just here in the U.S., but in China and around the world?
Yeah, well, China's zero COVID strategy is, it's been obvious that it's not going to contain Omicron for probably like 3 or 4 months. And so I've been worried about supply chains from China for years, and this is just one more example of the problem and what happens when you have one of these supply chain crises. Their cities are getting shut down, which sucks for them. But, for us, it's going to result in higher prices, more shortages, the standard things that we've been seeing, more inflation.
Do you think they're ever going to give this up, this COVID zero strategy? I mean, the rest of the world seems to have just said, okay, we can't, there's no way to contain it. And now, China is still going forward with this. Even other countries, I think even Australia and New Zealand, are they still doing COVID zero strategies? I think they've maybe given up on this. What do you think? What do you think, Matt, is going to be the future for this with China, if you could guess?
Yeah, they'll give up on it. I mean, Omicron is Omicron, right? You can't stop it, so they will give up on it. It's just a question of politically how much effort they're going to put into maintaining this sort of the bureaucracy that they've set up. They really, the Chinese government feels, I think that they feel that the restrictions that they've put up to address Omicron or to address COVID are actually helpful for other state purposes. So they're not super inclined to pull this stuff down, especially because there's a party Congress coming up where Xi Jinping will get, I guess, another term. So there's a big bureaucratic investment in zero COVID, but of course you can't stop COVID, so they will give it up. It's just a question of how.
And by other purposes, you mean like, cracking down on dissent or preventing political demonstration or keeping kind of the public in line, right? Which is scary when you consider all the restrictions we put up with here for so long and how, thank goodness it hasn't gone to that extreme, but could also be used for similar purposes here.
Yeah, basically tracking a population and organizing them in whatever way that they see fit. And some of that is things like, criminals who are at large, and some of it is just restricting what we would consider legitimate lawful behavior. It's an authoritarian state. And I'm not trying to be like, oh, well, everybody has their own way of governing. I'm just saying it's useful for a government that wants total control over a population.
Yeah, I never trusted China's numbers. I never really believed them, when they were like, oh, we only have this many cases.
I didn't either.
Yeah. But this actually makes me kind of believe that maybe their numbers were accurate. If they're still going forward with these extreme lockdowns when the rest of the world is starting to give up and saying, okay, we've done it, and China has vaccinated a huge portion of their population. So this, I don't know, does this make you guys actually think maybe they're not lying? Maybe they're telling the truth?
Yeah, I think that there were I had the same reaction, but over a couple of after a while, you're like, oh yeah, it is kind of true that they've probably done it. Enough people go there and see it. And also, one of the things they did is they made getting COVID a huge social stigma. So, that's a big part of it. The population or the people there they basically buy the government. They support the government's actions in locking people down in very aggressive ways. Of course, if you're locked down and, they're like, stay in this store for 3 days without food or water, people are upset. But broadly, I think the population there really thinks COVID is something that is just absolutely, it's a social stigma. So they are supportive. And now I think so you have the bureaucratic state is part of the incentive, but also the actual broad social stigma is part of the incentive. So undoing COVID zero is going to be tough for them. I think a lot of the strategists in the government know they have to undo it, but there's a lot of obstacles. But yeah, their numbers, they were, I don't really believe their numbers, but like the basic just like I don't believe our numbers, but like the basic direction was accurate.
And what do they mean when they say lockdown? Because lockdown means probably a little bit less here in the U.S. than lockdown means over there. Like, what do you mean by being in a store? Is that hyperbole, or might somebody, if they're stuck in a place when there's a lockdown, like genuinely be stuck in a place?
Yeah, that's what I mean. I mean, in Wuhan, it was like they were welding people into apartments.
Right.
Like they were just.
I do remember that. Yeah.
And I think that's what's happening. That could happen in China. I mean, you don't know because there's no independent reporting, so you don't really know what's happening. But you hear stories of just police in China just like they'll kill your pet or whatever it is if they feel that that was a sort of famous thing that they prevented a pregnant woman from going to the hospital and she lost her baby, and there's all these. Those are the sort of that caused lots of outrage in China. And there's just all these stories about the aggressive, intrusive measures that the Chinese government is taking. I imagine that things are spotty because China's government is pretty regionalized. So the central government doesn't have that much control over the country. So you'll see differences in how different regions approach the problem. But generally speaking, the incentive from the top is if you don't control this, you are to the regional governor, you're a failure. We're going to fire you. We're going to maybe even imprison you. So there's they can get super aggressive and arbitrary about what they're doing, and it's worked. It has stopped COVID from spreading, but this is kind of the downside. And also, right. I mean, what I understand is that China's been shut off from the rest of the world for the last year. Like the rest of the world started traveling, and people in China are not traveling anymore. So you've effectively got this massive country that's such an important part of our economy the global economy, that just no one is going really in or out.
Right. If you have total authoritarianism with massive social acceptance of that authoritarianism, that people can't leave their homes, do anything, absolute dystopia, we've learned, yes, that can make a significant dent in the spread of COVID until you relax those measures, and then your populace then gets whatever variant was, that you delayed getting, right? There's I think that's a phenomenon here that you're able to delay having your population, but unless you're literally willing to do these measures till the end of time, till the entire world global economy crashes, you're kind of just delaying what's going to happen.
Although there's benefit to delaying.
There is benefit to delaying for vaccines and therapeutics.
Right,
and things,
exactly. And then people will know, okay, don't do this, do that instead. But then somebody has to be first in order to find those things out. If everybody delays it, then you're all in the same boat once you finally do open your doors back up and go out there. The few people that I've spoken to that are in China say that they did go through these very, very strict lockdown measures, but and it was very harsh, but they all did it, and many of them very willingly. And then they were able to go back to normal a lot faster and to more of a normalcy than what many of the Western countries, like what we've experienced here, because they were so harsh in their lockdown measures. So for them, it was like small periods of lockdowns. The lockdowns were extremely intense, and then they would go back to normal and then maybe go back into these lockdowns. And so I'm curious, do you think, Matt, that the world will look at China and say that's the way to go in the future?
I don't know. I mean, it just depends. So you're right that there are advantages to delay. Well, I mean, one of the problems that China has is they just don't have that many hospital beds. We have a lot more hospital beds here per person. And so they're trying to figure out, well, what do we do? If COVID hits there, it could be really problematic in a way that it's not in many other places. So a delaying strategy allows them to plan for transitioning out of zero COVID to a more normalized form, and with vaccines and treatments and more capacity. That's the ideal, that they are able to, manage the transition out of zero COVID without that much suffering. I don't know if they'll be able to do that. I mean, once a bureaucracy, this is the problem with authoritarian or totalitarian states is that they can move really quickly, but then they're not they're kind of insulated from the decision makers are insulated, and sometimes it's hard for even the decision makers to know what's going on, so they can't really change that quickly. So I don't know whether they're going to be able to move out of this, or whether they're going to continue the bureaucratic intrusion that they've been having. I mean, that's kind of the open question. But you're right, there were really good reasons for delay, and hopefully they'll be able to, move out of this without too much suffering.
And Matt, are there any geopolitics at play here? This is happening, as the U.S. is saying that Russia is appealing to China, for weapons and material support of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. You have the U.S. warning China that if they do that, there will be consequences for them. They know that, China knows that if it locks down Shenzhen, it's interestingly kind of a form of Western sanctions. It'll hurt China as well, just like our sanctions hurt us as well as everybody else. But is it convenient? Is it useful? Is that a complete coincidence that this will act to kind of as a form of sanctions in a way on the U.S.?
I think it's coincidence. I mean, China is already engaged in sanctions. They're sanctioning Lithuania right now. They pretend they don't sanction. They sanction companies and individuals all the time. So this is the idea that they don't believe in sanctions is nonsense. I do think it's an open. You asked before about whether, I think China was widely admired for how they handled COVID for a long period of time. And now it's just kind of this open question about whether their transition will work, and that sort of admiration that they garnered might be undone. And that, plus their support of Russia in this war, could, really be a strategic setback for the Chinese government. I think Chinese strategists, they believe that the U.S. and the West are falling, that the East, with China at the center, is rising, and that there's a new world order coming with China at the center. And they are explicit about, seeking the downfall of U.S. military and cultural and financial and economic power. So all of what's happening has to be understood through that lens. They also just lie all the time. I mean, it's state policy. They believe that information is, they're Leninists. They believe that putting out information is purely about power. They don't really have any, they know there's a thing as truth, but they don't, as Leninists, they don't believe in truth when it comes from the government. So everything that they're doing and saying, I mean, I think it's a coincidence that Shenzhen is shut down right now. But you're right to be suspicious, because they, everything that the Chinese government does, all of their strategies are designed for what they think of as a historical inevitability of China sort of supplanting the U.S. as the dominant global power.
Well, Matt Stoller, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Coming up next, we'll tell you what's on our radars.